You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
You can play outside longer if you wear sunscreen. And you wouldn't jump out of an airplane without a parachute. Protection matters in life and in financial strategies, insurance, retirement, and more with New York Life. Visit NYL.com.
Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. My name is Chris Spangle. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And we are going to be talking about the Alec Baldwin situation. Have an acquaintance who is a longtime libertarian friend of mine that I met a decade ago. He reminded me before we started talking. And he works in the movie industry, so we're going to get his opinion on what happened with the Alec Baldwin situation. But just in case you're living under a rock, let's read from the New York Times and their coverage of the affidavit that was filed by the Santa Fe County there in New Mexico that kind of gives some details as to what happened. Alec Baldwin was rehearsing a scene in a movie called Rust down in New Mexico at the Bonanza Ranch, and he pointed a revolver towards the camera lens when the gun, which the crew had been told did not contain live rounds, suddenly went off and killed the cinematographer, according to the film's director, who was quoted in an affidavit. So he had been pointing the gun at the cinematographer, Halyna Hutchins, who was tragically killed in that incident, but it didn't answer the gun. How was the gun loaded? Why was the gun loaded? We're going to ask some of those questions to our expert today. But the director, who was wounded in the shooting, told investigators that he believed that the gun was safe and that it had been described as a cold gun in firearm safety announcements. And the guns on the film set were typically checked by the film's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, who is 24 years old, son of the stuntman that trained Brad Pitt in all of his stunts, but she's fairly new at this. And in Deadline today, the gaffer, or chief electrician of the movie set, Sergei Svetnoy, said that basically she was hired to save costs, and this was all the result of negligence and unprofessionalism. So, on the film sets, the order of who handles the weapons, the New York Times continues, typically involves a precise sequence, several armorers in the industry, but the actors have been handed guns on the set by both Mr. Halls and Mrs. Gutierrez-Reed, according to a producer of Rust who was asked not to be named because of an ongoing investigation. Now, they were sitting in a church, preparing for a scene. There was a lunch break. The crew was taken by shuttle elsewhere for the food, and when they returned, he was not sure if the firearm was checked again after lunch. So when these all these details have emerged and have added to, I don't know that this is adding to the mystery. I guess my big question is why live rounds are on a set at all, and obviously the question of, should there be criminal charges? Should there, is this a tragic accident? We're going to discuss some of these questions with our friend Chris Ratledge. Thank you so much for joining me, Chris. Tell us a little bit about what you do now, where you work in the film industry, and some of your experience.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I first started doing this in 1999, so I've been doing it for a little over 20 years now. I work in the camera department, so underneath the cinematographer. In the beginning of my career, I worked as a camera assistant. I was actually the person who would do all the lens changes and clap the slate. Back then it was loading film. Now it's all digital for the most part. And then in the last 10 years, I've been working as what's called a digital imaging technician. So I do a live on-set color correction and metadata collection for all of the look involved with the cinematography. Your article, you mentioned that the gaffer works closely with the DP or the cinematographer and the key grip to shape the lighting and color the lighting. And then I'll make adjustments to make sure everything matches scene to scene and, angle to angle and things like that. And like I said, that I've been doing for about 10 years now. And I currently reside in the Atlanta area. Used to be up in the Midwest working on mostly commercials, then started working on a lot of low-budget movies, similar to what this sounds like, honestly. In Ohio, that's where I started doing a lot more what we call long-form stuff. And typically down here in Atlanta, I've been working mostly on episodic television. I've done a couple movies here, but mostly it's been, hour-long and half-hour-long television programs.
Now, have you had an experience where there's been weapons used on a set? You know, have you been in a similar situation as this before?
I haven't done a Western, which I'd love to do, actually, honestly. Yeah, I actually did a movie last fall. It wasn't the first, it was the second thing I did back from our big COVID shutdown when nobody was working in our industry. And that show was tons of guns. It was a siege on a police station. And we had not only guns, but we had explosions and all kinds of stuff. And it was all indoors. And we had, some high-level armor and specialized prop department people that were trained. And all this stuff there's an enormous amount of stuff that goes on to prepare all this stuff to make it as safe as it can be. And we use, I'm not an armorer. This is not my department. I work with camera, and I'm not as close to the action as the camera operators are going to be, the director is going to be, and the DP, which is what sounds like happened based on the reports from what happened down on this movie.
Yeah, it sounds like Hill, this associate producer, was taking it off of the gun cart, announced that it was a cold gun, meaning there were no live rounds in the gun, and handed it to Alec Baldwin. So, he's operating under the assumption that there's no live rounds. I guess, why would real bullets be brought to a movie set? That's sort of my first question.
That's something that I can't fathom unless they're real bullets in our security personnel. Like if we have police with us, or if we're in a dangerous location that requires, armed personnel to be around, that should be the only armed weapons anywhere near a production. I am at a loss for how that happens. According to what I've been reading, this weapon was a vintage, Colt revolver that was, time period accurate for the period nature of the film, and was apparently used for target practice by some of the crew. I don't know if it was the armorer or some other crew, but this is what I'm reading online.
So they were having fun with the gun, and they were shooting live rounds, and that
couldn't necessarily be it couldn't necessarily be they were having fun, but they were also just checking operation and things like that.
Okay,
because if it won't fire a live round, then it would be even less likely to fire blanks.
And what is a blank? I've always heard about blanks, but I don't know what it does. It just not have like a bullet?
Theoretically, it has no hard projectile.
Okay.
I mean, and I am not a firearms expert. I'm not a armorer, but many of the times when I've been on set and we use guns, they talk about full loads, half loads, quarter loads, and these are all basically determining how loud and how big the muzzle flash will be from these things that are actually not shooting out a hard projectile, either a lead projectile or a copper projectile or something like that. But they may still have some kind of wadding material in them, like plastic or some other things. And the blanks are basically, if you think of a regular cartridge, what it looks like, whether it's a rifle or a pistol, you have the bullet down at the tip and you have the brass that's underneath. They're just crimped at the end, and they just kind of look like they're, been smashed in a, in a vise or something like that on four sides, and they're crimped down. So they're kind of open on the end, and they will, that's why you get the muzzle flash, because that stuff ignites as it flies out of the end of the gun.
Okay. All right. So I posted, I mean, I guess I'm not surprised. I have to stop being surprised when I open up Facebook.
Stuff happens way too often.
Yeah, I mean, I saw in Deadline that this is, this particular position is one of the deadliest positions. Cinematographer is one of the deadliest positions. There's been actually a lot of people killed in that position on movie sets, because you are in the middle of the action, there with the camera next to the director, in the middle of stunts. Famously, Brandon Lee, the son of Bruce Lee, died in a very similar fashion on set when a live round was put into a gun as opposed to a blank. Lots and lots of stunt people have passed away. This gets a lot of headlines, but how commonplace is it for people to get injured on movie sets, or for there to be fatalities?
I mean, I would say fatalities are pretty low, quite honestly. Safety is a very big concern for us. There obviously right now there's this huge backdrop about this labor strike in the film industry, and it's mainly due to the safety concerns of being overworked. I mean, I actually just got laid off because I'm unvaccinated, and that's not going to fly with the hardcore left on that run the film studios and stuff like that. So I've been let go, and I'm pursuing my other options and seeing what I'm going to do about that, including may consider vaccination because I have a family to provide for.
Sure.
But regardless of that situation, the first 2 days on the TV series that I just got let go, I slept in my car on my drive home because you are so exhausted from the hours that we put in. And if you look at, okay, the biggest risk that we have a lot of times is nodding off behind the wheel on our drives to or from work, and hurting ourselves or causing another accident that would, cause more damage and more people get hurt as well. That's probably the most common thing. But, when you have a lot of stunts, there's obviously like trips and falls and things like that. Ladders, we use ladders a ton in this industry. So there's a lot of falls that happen. So, you have, I would say, a pretty routine amount of sprains and broken bones and things like that can happen. I wouldn't be able to give you any kind of numbers or anything like that. But, yeah, I mean,
I've been surprised, as my friend Miss Pat made a TV show, call time is at 4:30 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning. You're working sometimes till 11 at night. People go, well, boo-hoo, these people make millions of dollars, but people like yourself don't make millions of dollars. The dozens of people that were working on that show don't make that kind of money. They're making, a regular middle America salary to work.
Yeah. Well, actually,
and you don't see your kids, right?
Right. That show, from what I understand, was what we call a tier 1 low budget. And I don't know how into the weeds I may get for talking about this stuff, but there's a categorical limit on, like, if your budget is between this number and this number, it's this tier. Okay. And that allows certain concessions that the labor unions have agreed to on salaries and times that you can work and things like that. Really gets far into the weeds on the details. But the people that are working on that show could have been making as little as 40 cents on the dollar for their typical wage.
So you as a union member, you as a person who does what you do, can look at jobs based on these different tiers and say, all right, I need to work, so I'm going to go with this tier, or I'm at a level where I can work at the higher tier and I'm going to get more concessions in terms of lower times, better pay, whatever it's other benefits.
It's more honestly, like, a lot of times right now, the business in general is just bonkers. There's a ton of content being made, but there's a ton of content being made at all budget levels.
Right.
So it also just depends on what you're available to do, what you want to do. Sometimes people like to go do these smaller budgeted films because it's different than just, the regular, like the episodic TV thing that I've been doing here for years. It's very formulaic, like you were mentioning, Miss Pat, like this show that I just got let go, every Monday, we're starting at 7 a.m. We work at least a 13-hour day. Then you have your commute. And then, the next day, the call time's a little bit later, and it's a little bit later. And then by Friday, it's like 5 or 6 p.m. and you're working all night into what we call a Fraturday. And that just amplifies all of this stuff. So, like, now you're like working nights, and then Monday morning you're working days again. So you sleep till 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, and then go to bed early on Sunday night to try to turn your body clock around. And it's just, there's been tons of studies about how, inconsistent and not enough sleep and rest is really detrimental to your health. And it can cause all kinds of other problems too. Now, I don't believe that this particular show, because it was a really short schedule, was facing those problems. It was basically just sounding like it was just negligence and penny pinching.
You mean Rust? Yeah. Not Miss Pat's show. Everybody's treated very well on that set. No, the Rust movie, actually, I read that a few people had walked off hours or days before, kind of because of those concerns, because it was lower budget, so they were trying to cram in as much as possible. Yep. And they were worried about some of these safety concerns that you're mentioning and some of these hours. And, were saying, hey, we're cutting corners that we shouldn't be cutting corners, and this is what everybody's striking about, and they walked off the set, and then tragedy strikes. And there's been a lot of discussion in police circles around kind of what you just said, because police officers will work these shifts where I remember 20 years ago when I was in high school and I wanted to become a cop, the thing that made me not want to become a police officer, and the ride along with that police officer, Officer Brian, he said, yeah, you do there's 3 shifts and they work backwards. So you work the 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon shift, and then they dial you back to the 12 to 6 shift. And then they dial you back to the 3 to 12 shift. And he's like, so you know, if we just did it the other way, it'd probably be a little bit easier because you'd kind of stair step, but you're just shocking your body with some of the sleep, and police officers are making mistakes that they wouldn't normally make. So do you think that this incident and some of these concerns will kind of accelerate? Because, I mean, you tell me, every union has their complaints, and right, you know, everything you just mentioned is perfectly justifiable. But like, what's management's pushback on this? What is the pushback from the industry saying, well, we've got to do it this way because?
I mean, that's one of the things I'm so insulated because I'm a rank and file member, right? Like I'm not ever in a position where I'm talking to the executives at these studios or the people that finance these independent films like Rust. So I don't know exactly what it is. I mean, I literally think it is like, a lot of times it is you go overseas and you sell a movie based on a poster mock-up and the name attached to it, Alec Baldwin as, you know, the grizzled old grandpa cowboy character. It's like, oh yeah, we can sell that especially in foreign markets and stuff. And they'll get money to make the movie. And then they'll say, okay, we have this much money to make the movie. What do we have to do what's in the script to meet this number? I think
Rust was like 36 days or something to make the movie or something.
Oh, I don't think it was that much. I'd be shocked if it was that much. Okay. Honestly. Like, I mean, that's not what I read, but that could be, it could be, that's kind of, not inhumane. If it's a shortish movie, it's like a 2.5 hour runtime movie. Then
how long would that normally take to shoot?
I mean, if you did it the right way, you could do a 90-minute movie in 36 days. 36 days is a weird number. I'd push for at least 40. But we basically break it down into, you know, the old rule of thumb is that a page of a script is theoretically about a minute of runtime on screen.
Okay.
So if you have a 90-page script, you have a 90-minute movie. And then you have to divide that, and we count how much we do in a day on page count, basically. So today we'll have, and it's divided into eighths. So we have, you know, today we'll do 4 1/8 of a page. But a lot of these things, I mean, I'm basically, this TV show that I was doing, you know, we're doing 7 pages, 8 pages a day sometimes, which is like shooting an hour-long movie in 12 days, which is a breakneck pace. It's kind of insane. And we often don't make our days and they have to add more at the end, kind of a thing. But if you're talking about Rust, and I've done a ton of these low-budget theatrical release movies where, I mean, I did one where we shot it in 18 days. We basically just shot 6 days in a row. We did 6-day weeks, and then we had basically like 30 hours off for our weekend, and then turned around and did it all again for 3 weeks straight. And that was the whole movie. So it can be done that way. And the fact that it can be done that way means that it's like, well, we did it this way last time, so why should we bother putting any more resources or time or examining it? Let's just apply the formula and see what we get. And there's a lot of broken people along that path when you undertake that, and it really destroys you. And if you're doing Rust, like, so that's what, 36 days. So that's at least a 8 week schedule. Theoretically, you could do that without really destroying yourself, but also depends on, like, as the crew member, what are you coming from and what are you going to do next? Like, did you just come off a 6 month job where you worked 70 hours a week for 6 months and your head is spinning because you don't know what planet you're on?
Right.
So, and then you add into things like, I mean, I remember feeling like I didn't get a fair shake when I was in my early 20s starting this stuff. But, you know, an armorer is a lot different than a second AC. Like, I have to clap the slate and load the film. I don't have to make sure someone doesn't die because I put the wrong bullet in the gun. So there's something to be said for ageism and discrimination along those lines. But even if you come from a family that does that, which apparently she does, or stunts or something like that, like, it's hard to not immediately go, why was someone so young put in charge of this very, very dangerous position to, you know, it must have been just to cut costs.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what Sergei Svetnoy, that gaffer in Deadline, said. He wrote on Facebook, to save a dime, sometimes you hire people who are not fully qualified for the complicated and dangerous job, and you risk lives of other people who are close and your lives as well. I understand that you always fight for the budget. You cannot allow this to happen. It is true professionals that can cost a little more and sometimes be a little bit more demanding, but it's worth it. No penny is worth the life of a person. You know, he was standing there next to Joel Souza. You know, he goes on to say, I'm sure that we had the professionals in every department but one, the department that was responsible for the weapons. There's no way a 24-year-old woman can be a professional with armory. There's no way that her more or less the same age friend from school, neighborhood, Instagram, or God knows where can be a professional in this field. Professionals are the people who have spent years on sets, people who know this job A to Z. These are the people who have the safety on the set level of reflexes. They do not need to be told to put the sandbag on a tripod, fix the ladder on the stage, or fence off the explosion site. They have it in their blood. To save a dime, sometimes you hire people who are not fully qualified for the complicated and dangerous job, and you risk the lives of other people who are close and your lives as well. So, yeah, just like he said, I mean, that's the we here on the Chris Spangle Show are not anti-expert, because that reflexiveness, you know, if you want to know anything about podcasting, I know all about it. I've done it for 15 years. You know, I've worked in radio for 20. You know, you build in 20 years of doing something a certain reflexiveness that just is instinctual, and it almost becomes hard, you know, to teach other people that kind of stuff. And that's sort of the weird thing about our society today, is that, you know, we just sort of think, oh, well, anybody could be an armorer. No, I don't know. You know, you can, but it takes some apprenticeship.
I would actually push back against that a little bit. Like, you could be a pro at 24. You absolutely could, because some people start in this business in their teens, right? You know, and it's, you know, whether they're in front of the camera, especially if they're in front of the camera, if they came from an acting background and they just have been around it forever. And if actually, I don't know if you know this, and I can't remember his name, but do you remember The Adventures of Pete and Pete from Nickelodeon years ago?
The ginger kid, and
older Pete is actually an electrician now. He works on set in the lighting department. So there's now older Pete is probably 40 or older, but he's not 24. But, you know, I've seen competition shooters who are teenagers, and by the time they're 24, they could certainly have wherewithal and, you know, come up to speed on the set etiquette level. But obviously we're talking about this because this happened. And this is where, you know, the fingers are going to start pointing. And you're like, from everything we're hearing, I believe I even read somewhere that she was a replacement or she was hired from the get-go as a cheaper option. And the cheaper option thing this business is so terrible. I don't know how it is in radio, but this business is so terrible about prioritizing savings. And
that's why we don't have an industry anymore.
Being so ridiculous about tripping over dollars to pick up pennies.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about things like Halyna Hutchins being shot or Sarah Jones being ripped to shreds by a train that they shouldn't have been on, a train track, you know, this kind of stuff is just ridiculous, especially so people can just watch movies when they're at home. Right. You know, it
doesn't have to be life or death. Yeah. It's somewhat, you know, yeah. So, okay. So you commented on a status that I made because everybody just rushed to put Alec Baldwin in jail for this. You know, so now we'll play the blame game here as we sort of start to wrap up a little bit. I I am a longtime libertarian, as are you. And one of the things that we have always really tried to advocate for is that, due process. We don't need a law for everything. We don't need a government fix or criminal charges to fix everything. Alec Baldwin, yes, he should have probably checked the gun, but he's been told by 3 people in that chain of possession that there's no live ammunition in here. But everybody, because he's made anti-gun statements in the past and they're on the opposite political side, want to lock him up. So I found that to kind of be anti-libertarian in a lot of ways. But does he bear any responsibility from an industry standpoint, like having experience on these sets? You see a lot of people in the comments going, well, if me and my husband were at the shooting range and we didn't check our weapon, we'd go to jail. Why doesn't Alec Baldwin go to jail? Is it any different? Is there a difference here?
I don't know if there's any kind of criminal code kind of, standpoint from where it would be different. But I will say that the atmosphere on set is different than it used to be. It used to be that you were completely silent. You shut up and you took all of what anybody gave you, in a very kind of military or college hazing kind of way. You just put up with whatever was the thing, because if you didn't do it, then you were seen as weak and you couldn't hack it, and they'd remember who you were to never hire you again.
That's how radio was too. I mean, that's how I came up. Like you were the stooge, you were the goat that was made fun of.
They weren't even going to bother to learn your name, right?
Because if you didn't survive that, you weren't going to make it in the business, because it's a tough dog-eat-dog business, and those days are gone. We don't even hire interns, but if you did, you couldn't make fun of them. You had to be nice to them, which is not fair, because I was treated poorly.
Yes, it's not fair, but it's also encouraging that it's moving in a direction that's a little bit more humane. Right. And to that point, the reports of several members of the camera crew walking on whatever it was that day or the day before with their equipment from that show, that was unheard of. Like, I've never heard of that until until about now, of saying, hey, this is grotesquely unsafe in a, overarching methodical way. Like this, the whole way that you guys are doing everything on this show, we object to, and we're going to walk away from. And that not being a career suicide is a whole new thing. Now,
because in radio, if you got up in the middle, you got pissed in the middle of a radio segment and you got up and walked out on that broadcast, you weren't coming back, because you had violated a professional code and a norm that was so sacred in the industry that you don't come back from that. You're not a professional.
There seems to be a similar kind of awakening happening here. I don't know if it'll stay. I don't know if it'll change into something else. But the whole thing with Alec Baldwin, like I totally get, unfortunately, he kind of set himself up for that with his past behavior in his tweets and stuff like that. It just kind of sets up this beach ball for people to target. But he's going to be, I've worked with him, actually. I worked with him back in 2017 on a movie in Cincinnati that I did. Okay. And he was very pleasant. He was actually playing a cop, and that was a contemporary movie in modern times. Mm-hmm. But, totally, he and Christian Slater actually on the set in the same scene were cutting us up, and just we got a lot of things delayed because they were just giving each other so much shit that they were, getting us off track, and it was just funny. But, I never got the impression that he was not there to work, not there to do the good job, not to do an honest day's work, and was legitimately doing that. Now, I don't know. There, you hear about like that show, the ABC show, The Rookie, is now not going to have any live guns on their sets and things like that. I don't know if that's an overreaction or not, because obviously these safety protocols can be put in place and followed. But I don't know if there's a place for criminal charges. I think there could be, because as far as I know, he was also listed as a producer on this film. Now, that may just be a title that gives him more money, and he has no day-to-day operational decisions to make on things like that, or I don't know. But if he's going to take that title and be liable, that's kind of the question from that angle. That's the part that I would kind of mention in that comment on your post. But ultimately, too, from what I understand, this was a rehearsal that this happened during.
Yeah.
I don't know why in the world, especially at 68 years old, this man would pull the trigger on a rehearsal. You know, unless you're doing, and we do like fire rehearsals. They'll yell out fire in the hole, you know, blank test or whatever. But that's done offset. It's not done with the camera framing and everything. That's all part of the scene. And quite honestly, that's probably why she was killed and the director was killed, because normally nowadays we're off on the side. I actually run one of these places called Video Village, where there's screens set up and they monitor what's being shot from a separate section that's not right behind the camera. And if he's aiming right up towards the camera and she's looking over the shoulder, and there's a tiny little monitor on the side of the cameras that the camera operator uses for the framing, if that's what they were standing there and checking, then that's how they got into the line of fire, literally. It should have never happened. But yeah, to me, from everything I've read, this assistant director, who I've read has had some multiple complaints in the past.
He worked on The Crow.
Yeah. Oh, and worked on The Crow. It was a second unit though, right?
Yeah. So he was not responsible,
same movie, but not even the same thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of grossly serendipitous, but like, but that AD and whoever decided.
Yeah, the assistant director that handed the gun, having a little problem with Chris's internet. But yeah, the assistant director, let's see here. I'm reading in the Sarah Jones case, where the assistant director was actually charged and was facing a potential sentence of 10 years in prison. And I believe actually got jail time. On the movie Midnight Rider, Ms. Jones was working as a camera assistant.
I had to hire this armorer.
Oh, hold on. We lost your internet. So I was talking about the Sarah Jones case, where the assistant director so Sarah Jones and other crew members, including Mr. Miller, who was also directing the film, were setting up shots on the tracks when a train unexpectedly appeared, killing Ms. Jones and injuring several others. And so you ended up having an assistant director face jail time in that case, because he didn't make the set safe enough. So yeah, maybe this, I believe his name is Hill. I tried to find that article real quick. But yeah, Hill was the assistant director and the armorer. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, like Alec Baldwin, it's sort of a stretch because he had absolutely no intent to kill this person. I don't think any of the other three here involved in this chain of custody of this firearm had any intent, but you can go to jail and face charges for negligence, in unsafe workplaces, and that's totally reasonable. If there has to be penalties for crimes where, there are victims. This is not a victimless crime. Obviously, a child and a husband are missing their loved one, and obviously you have the injury of the other director. So yeah, I mean, I could certainly see, but at the end of the day, like, I'm not going to rush to the day, oh, Alec Baldwin killed someone, lock him up. Let's just take a beat, let some investigations happen. There should be investigations and figure it out.
I agree.
So
I agree. I mean, this, whether or not, now I'm saying charges, I'm not saying convictions necessarily. There's also like, what do you gain from it? Like, that's the, and I mentioned that too. It's like, these independent films, especially, like they create the company out of nowhere, just from the financiers getting together, and they create an LLC. Like, it's called Rust Films LLC. That's not Paramount, that's
right.
Not Disney, that's a group of financiers and producers getting together to bankroll a project. And they'll continue to do this kind of stuff. That's the thing that's unfortunate, and other people will be in. The sad thing is that a lot of times they won't learn from their mistakes. They won't learn from other things happening, like Sarah Jones. And they'll make a ridiculous, comedy of errors that just keeps adding up. And then eventually something bad like this happens.
Yeah.
And I'm fortunate that it hasn't happened to me or anyone I know on sets that I've worked on, but I know lots of people. Like, I moved to Atlanta very shortly out, like 3 years after Sarah Jones was killed down here in Savannah. And I know several people that I work with and have worked with repetitively that knew her very well. So like, it's a small community, and it's just, we can all see ourselves facing that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an unfortunate reality of life. Like, if you remember the state fair collapse here in Indiana in 2014 maybe?
When the stage collapsed.
Yeah, the stage collapsed during a concert during the state fair here in Indiana, and several people were killed, and it was a tragedy that, there was some negligence, but that accident changed. We ran a booth in 2016, and you had to have all kinds of different insurances and checks, and it made it more secure for vendors, for people attending the state fair. There's no surefire way to to guarantee everybody's safety. That's just the reality that we're living in. You are not guaranteed to walk out your front door and return at the end of the day, no matter how many laws we pass. But people do need to face consequences sometimes for their choices, and it does help make us all better. So, Chris, thank you so much. I don't know if you have anything you want to promote, but if you do, please, share.
No, not really. I mean, I would, from a very selfish standpoint, I would say, I don't know where you and your networks and stuff like that fall on the whole vaccine mandate thing, but it's affecting me personally right now. I'm actually a COVID survivor. I had it in January this past year. And the sad thing about like this whole, it's insane, this whole union solidarity thing that the IATSE is pushing for all the film crews. They made an agreement with the producers to permit them, if they choose, to implement a vaccine mandate. And this was in July. So this was long before Biden's OSHA step around the law kind of thing came into play. And I don't know how many people, at least half a dozen, I think, on my show were summarily just, booted. And I could see a bigger argument if you hadn't already had it, but it leaves people like me who've had it. And I actually went through the process of going to the doctor myself and monthly getting antibody tests, saying, hey, I still have antibodies. Why can't I work and be considered vaccinated? Yeah. And this whole thing has become so political and so monocultural that it's going to be a very interesting field to try to navigate.
We've lost our minds with it. We've thrown every bit of common sense.
It's delirious.
It's
the film industry, Chris, is absolute ground zero for the Stockholm syndrome.
Oh God, I remember seeing during the TV show taping people dressed up like astronauts, and this was before I think there was even a shot available. But yeah, I mean, I've seen it from the various projects that I work on, just the way that people have acted in the film industry or the entertainment industry at large. It's just there's even in my own, I'm gonna do a show on it. You should make a decision as to what you need to do with the vaccine. You should not listen to a podcaster's medical advice on what to do with the vaccine. But when it comes to mandates and government involvement, it's a no-brainer. Like, it's just Joe Biden doesn't get to use and draft every corporation into service. Like, that's just not how it works. So, well, I hope your job situation gets figured out soon. I'd love to say I hope that they come to their senses, but
that's not going
to happen. So you'll have to just.
I know, I've been around long enough to know who I'm working with.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate you being here and giving us some insight. It was great. Thank you, Chris Ratledge. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.